And hopefully this will give you a bit of an insight into what psychology is. And if you've joined any of my other sessions, it maybe will show you how psychology is different to sociology or different to criminology. And hopefully we can look at kind of what content is in psychology and also what pathways can psychology take you to if you want to go to university, for example, or if you want to look at what jobs psychology can be helpful for. So what is psychology? And I often get this question a lot by lower school students because it's a subject we don't do at lower school here. So it is an A-level specific subject. It's something we do at sixth form. And essentially, psychology is the kind of scientific study of the human mind and human behaviour. So you won't be able to read minds after doing this A-level, but you will be able to actually analyse people's behaviour. And that's a really interesting skill to have because you'll often find you kind of thinking about, well, why has someone done that? Or why has someone behaved that way? So psychology is a 2-year course, just like most A-levels, and it is an A-level which you will have exams in. So there's no coursework, it's just 3 exams at the end of the 2 years, so after year 13, and it's kind of made up of lots of different topics which hopefully are really interesting and will help give you an understanding of psychology. So in year 1, so year 12, we look at lots of different topics, but what we're going to have a look at is kind of what those topics are. So the first one really, and this is a key thing in psychology, it's very, very perspective driven. And what I mean by that is there's lots of different views about why people behave the way that they do. So in psychology, we've got different approaches. So you've got the biological approach, for example, and they think that all human behaviour can be explained at a biological level. So for example, maybe it's that the fact they don't have enough serotonin in their brain, or maybe it's because they've got damage to their prefrontal cortex in their brain. So biological approach really explains all behaviour that way. You've got different approaches like the behaviourist approach, which believes that actually everything is a taught behaviour. So for example, it's because of punishment or it's because something's been reinforced to us and that's why we act the way that we do. And you've also got different approaches like the cognitive approach, which think everything is to do with our cognition, how we think, and some people maybe just their thinking is very faulty. So like we said, approaches really underpins everything in psychology. No matter what we look at, there's always going to be different views about why people behave the way that they do. But that's what I really like about psychology. There's not one answer, but that's often quite frustrating, but it's good for debate. Okay, another key topic in psychology is social influence. So if I told you to shock someone to 450 volts to the point at which they probably die, would you do it? And why would you do it? We look at why do people go along with groups in society, even if they don't believe what they're saying. We look at kind of how does social change happen. So we've looked at recently in lesson kind of the Black Lives Matter movement and how did they become very successful in getting their message out there, and all of those kind of I guess social factors which can impact our behaviour. We also look at the topic attachment, and this is where we look at kind of why do we attach? Why do babies need to attach to an adult? What happens if you don't have an attachment growing up? So we look at a case study of a girl who's been locked in her room for 6 years. What happens in terms of what impact does that have on her? Is she going to be able to make up any issues that she's got because of that? Or does it have a long-lasting impact? And we look at kind of animal studies as well. So looking at what happens if we take a monkey away from its mum and put it in a cage and give it a fake mother, but then we also give it kind of a cloth. Which one is it going to go to? So there's lots of really interesting studies in attachment, and it's quite a interesting topic because we've all been attached to a parent at some point and we probably still are attached. We look at, and this is really something that encompasses psychology, is mental disorders and mental illness. So in year 1, so in year 12, we look at 3 main disorders, which are OCD, depression and phobias. And within that, we look at kind of what are the different explanations to why people have those disorders, but also how would we treat those disorders. And that's a really interesting topic. And actually, on a trip that we do, you often can get a treatment for a phobia when we go to the London Zoo. So I'll talk about that in a bit. Other topics we do are memory. So this is really good for helping you revise for exams because you then start to actually figure out, well, how does my memory work? And essentially this is looking at, well, what are the different models? What are the different kind of theories on how our memory works? And also what impacts our memory being effective or not? So for example, in eyewitness testimony, if I see a crime happen, what's going to impact how will I remember information about maybe who did it or the crime scene itself? Okay. And then lastly, in I guess the whole of psychology, what's really, really important is research methods. We cannot understand humans if we don't research them. We have to research humans and human behaviour. So this is where we look at kind of the importance of experiments. We look at questionnaires, interviews, observations, and how do we actually kind of look at human behaviour and what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of all of those different ways in which we can study people. Year 2, oh, that picture wasn't going to show up, but year 2, we look at lots of different topics as well. We look at biopsychology. So this is really kind of like biology in that sense, in terms of what's happening in our brain and how is that impacting people, okay, and how is that impacting our behavior. So what happens if a rod goes through my head and therefore I've got brain damage? What impact is that going to have on a person? We look at biological rhythms, so our sleep patterns, for example, and how those and what can impact our sleep patterns. We look at things like what I find really interesting is split brain research, where actually kind of can one side of the brain control the other side of the brain, and what happens if we have a split brain. So there's lots of interesting topics in biopsych, but that is quite sciencey, and that's why in a minute we'll talk about the subject specific requirements. Okay, we look at a whole topic on schizophrenia. So we look at the different explanations to why people have schizophrenia. What's the biological approach to schizophrenia, for example, or what is the interactionist approach to schizophrenia? And we really look at kind of weighing up, is it nature? Is it something that is out of our control, or is it actually nurture, which is also out of our control, but in terms of like, is it our upbringing, for example, or is it the fact that it's who we decide to spend time with? And does that then help develop a disorder such as schizophrenia? One of my personal favourite topics is relationships. So looking at kind of why are we attracted to the people that we're attracted to? Why do we choose the partners that we're with, or the husbands or the girlfriends that we're with? And also looking at what happens when those relationships break down. So what are the psychological, I guess, factors involved in that? And we also look at kind of what's happening now with virtual relationships and like Tinder, things like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and how are those all having an impact on the relationships that we have, friendships and also romantic relationships. And one of the most popular topics in psychology is forensic psychology, and it's really similar to criminology, if you've heard me speak about criminology, in the fact that we look at why do people commit crime. But the key difference is that we look at it on a psychological level rather than a sociological level, and looking at social factors. So what we'll do is look at kind of, is there a gene that can increase the likelihood that you are more likely to commit crime? Is there certain personality factors that make us more likely to commit crime, such as being an extrovert? Or, for example, is it who we hang around with? Does that make us more likely to commit crime? Or is there any evolutionary explanation as to why someone might commit crime? So we not only look at why people commit crime, we also look at how do we then treat offenders and how do we deal with offenders. So, for example, comparing anger management to something like prison, which is more effective? Why is it more effective? And a really interesting topic in forensics is looking at how we profile offenders. How can we predict who's going to commit crime, and how can we predict if a criminal, where's he going to go next, what's he going to do next, and how the crime scene can really give us some hints about that. And then again, what underpins, I guess, all of psychology, let alone year 2, is just issues and debates. So a debate is looking at two things in psychology. So is it nature? Can that explain our behaviour? Or is it nurture? Okay, is all of your behaviour determined by something, or do you have choice in if you would decide to be a criminal? Okay, so we look at the debates and we look at issues such as gender bias, cultural bias, ethics, what's unethical to research, what's ethical to research, and that really underpins a lot of psychology. So that's the content. If we look through kind of key skills and assessment, really similar to sociology and criminology in that sense. It's very perspective driven, looking at why different views on why people behave the way that they do. So analysis and evaluation is really key, looking at strengths and weaknesses of studies, looking at strengths and weaknesses of explanations, and also looking at the analysis side to it and kind of what is the impact of that theory, or what is the impact of that behavior that that person is showing. Okay, so the exam, there's 3 exams at the end of the 2 years, so it's 100% written examination, and it's a mixture of written responses. So a bit like how sociology is very essay based, there is essays in psychology, a 16-mark essay, but there's also multiple choice questions. So it's a real mixture from kind of 1-mark questions to 16-mark questions. So there's a wide range of questions that potentially could be asked, and that's sometimes a good thing. So subject specific requirements for psychology, it is a demanding subject, so it does require a lot of resilience, a lot of dedication, organisation, someone who's dedicated to the subject and really wants to do well in it, and that's why we require a grade 5 in English, maths and science. Now biology is the most important science because there's a lot of biology involved in psychology, because psychology is a science. Okay, so we look at kind of like we spoke about biopsychology, and a lot of that is based on kind of like neural transmission and looking at like synapses and stuff, and we we also, there's maths required in the research method part to psychology. So but it's kind of like GCSE level maths, but it's still a requirement. So we look at things like statistical analysis, we look at how can we make conclusions from data. So it's all very maths and science driven. English is obviously very important because, again, it's an exam written focus, and therefore you are going to have to know how to structure questions. You are going to have to write 16-mark essays, and that's why English, maths and science is really, really important in order to do psychology. So I often get the question of what does psychology go with? So I was looked at what my students do over the past 7 years at Caulfills, and really popular subjects that psychology go with are things like sociology and criminology, which are really obvious ones, but also health and social care, because there's a psychological module in health and social care. You also in sport look at sports psychology, so that can really help with that subject. Biology is a given because there's biology in psychology, maths, business. So those ones are, I guess, popular subjects to take with psychology, but also that's not limitless, so you can take it with whatever subject you would like. These just kind of maybe help embed the knowledge a bit more. Psychology is one of the most popular, or it is the most popular A-level at Caulfills, and it's the second highest A-level taken up by students in the UK, so it is a really popular subject. Enrichment opportunities for psychology. So this is kind of what we do that makes it fun. We do a behind bars criminal conference where ex-offenders, including a murderer, come into Caulfills, and you get to speak to them. You get to kind of ask them questions. They talk about their experiences and like how was prison for them? Would they go back to prison? Why did they commit the crimes that they committed? And that's always a really, really popular day for psychology, sociology and criminology students. It's one of my favourite days ever. We also do a brain day with Dr. Guy Sutton. He's a lecturer and also a neuropsychologist, and so he kind of we dissect a brain, an animal brain. We look at kind of what's the impact of alcohol on the brain, what's the impact of drugs on the brain, how does that then link to disorders, how can we explain people's behaviour by using biology, and that's also a really, really interesting day. We also do a London trip, which is, again, one of my favourites. This is where we do a one-night stay and we get to visit the Royal Courts of Justice and get to watch criminal cases, which will really help with forensic psychology. We get to go to the London dungeons to help us with like punishment elements to psychology and how we deal with offenders. And we also have a chance to be hypnotized for a phobia. So I was last year hypnotized for my spider phobia and it didn't really work, but we'll maybe see what happens next year when we go. And there's also a trip to the Body Worlds museum, which really helps kind of embed again that biopsychology and that science element to psychology. There's also lots of, I guess, lectures available in terms of helping you revise and exam content. So the biggest enrichment, though, would be documentaries and Netflix, and I don't know if anyone's seen 100 Humans on Netflix, but I would definitely give that a go if you're maybe interested in psychology and what psychology is about. So that's really about studying human behaviour, and it's a really interesting documentary, but there's so much stuff out there that will really help you. There's also a documentary on Netflix called Explained, and it goes through like explaining disorders or explaining anxiety, and all of those really help with the subject of psychology. And that's why psychology is a really, really popular subject, and it's also an amazing subject because actually it's all around us, similar to sociology in that way. It's all around us and it really helps you understand why people behave the way that they do. So future pathways, I realise I've got 1 minute, sorry. Future pathways for psychology are kind of endless, but popular pathways are things like counselling, people going into being a counsellor, people going into being sports psychologists or a kind of any role within sport. You've got people who are business psychologists nowadays, and that's really, really interesting. And you've got lots of other jobs like such as social care, healthcare, mental health nurse, lots of jobs in the criminal justice system, so like probation officer, police officer, working within prisons. Teaching is a really obvious one. There's lots of educational psychologists out there as well, and also recently consumer psychology and how can we use kind of manipulating human behaviour to make people buy our products. So there's lots of different things that you can go into, and if you do have any questions, please let me know in the chat box, or alternatively you can email me or come and find me in school, and I'd be more than happy to help you with your decisions or to give you a textbook to have a look. And I hope you've enjoyed this session, and thank you so much for listening.